Welcome back to SwitchCorner. Today we're going to be taking a look at Foregone on the Nintendo Switch. This one, it's had countless comparisons thrown around about it, or even just terms made to hook you. So think like Dead Cells or Metroidvania, but can it stand up to its idols, or even are these comparisons fair? Well, hit subscribe if you love the Switch as much as we all do here, join our growing family, and let's get started. So story, and right off the bat I gotta say it is thin stuff here. It starts with good intentions but does very little to develop beyond setting the stage. Here though, it's basically years after a devastating war turned your city to rubble. Now it seems though that fate is not on your side, because not only can you not recover, but there's now a new all-corrupting evil known as the Harrow out to destroy the city more. As a super soldier, it is down to you to investigate, which means kill everything in sight and work out what's going on with this enemy. Well, you will find the occasional cutscene and text box moment. The story after that opening, it's largely relegated to nothing more than an excuse to get your kill on, and I gotta say that's absolutely fine with me. I didn't really expect much more. I was never coming here for the story, and personally I don't think you should either. If you do want a little bit more depth though, you will find books scattered around this world that do go into a little bit more detail but are completely optional. For me, the problem, it just lacks any real depth to the character or the world from the very beginning, so it just never hooked me enough to make me feel that drive to hunt down all these extra anthologies of information. So gameplay, and first of all, this is not Dead Cells. Maybe the combat idea slightly and a few of the weapons, but it really couldn't be further from that experience. That is a roguelite. This most definitely is not. I will say now as well, we have some serious issues with Foregone that we're going to address later in the video. Foregone though, this is an attempt at blending the Metroidvania idea with a linear structure to its levels. What this essentially amounts to though is levels which force you to go off the main path, to flick a switch or kill a set number of enemies with keys above their head to unlock a door. Even these moments though, the map might look Metroidvania, when you can go up or down, but they are extremely linear in design. You'll be weaving left and right for sure to give you that feeling of exploration, but when you actually sit back and take a look, it gives you very little freedom here as you quickly run through these moments. The controls, for the most part, they're decent. You'll start with a relatively weak skill set, but as you progress, you will encounter boss moments, and these normally result in you receiving a new move to add to your repertoire. An early example, probably an hour or so into the game, you do get an air dash, while later in the game you'll be able to jump from walls. By the end of the game, I'll say I was mostly happy with my character's abilities, but it leads to a very basic, an extended opening, maybe half the game, where combat just comes down to attack, dodge to the other side, attack, repeat. I wanted to love this one, but I gotta admit now, I was getting very impatient with the repetition, even after the first hour or so of gameplay. Metroidvanias, they have this fantastic mechanic where a new move unlocks a new area, maybe you couldn't jump there before, but now you got a double jump and there you go. You just can't beat that sense of progression. Here they try to attach the moves to the levels, almost give you a sense of forward progression. It just doesn't land that same impact. It never feels essential. Rather, you're kind of going through the motions. The levels actually become, because of this, very predictable. You don't know what to do, just think about that last move you received. If anything, honestly, the whole mini Metroidvania style levels, they don't really add anything to the experience. It feels honestly more like it's just trying to pad its runtime than trying to really build any creativity. So yeah, basically expect to do the same thing. Look for a switch to push, and that's about as rewarding as gameplay goes. It's pretty low on the rewarding feeling. These levels then, they're punctuated by checkpoints. These are teleports that lead back to a hub world, and we'll get to that a little bit later. The problem is though, all this extra exploration means the levels are pretty long, and sometimes you'll have miles to travel back to get to where you maybe died last time. The one perk in Death, all doors or switches, they remain pushed or open, so let's say you opened a shortcut, you will at least have access to that. The combat then, it's reinforced with a somewhat decent selection of weapons, and they're nice in their variety, everything from swords to spears to gunchucks. Yes, you heard that right, gunchucks, and I'll admit, pretty epic stuff. This is then supported with a secondary range weapon. That's everything from a pistol to a shotgun to my favourite, the bow and arrow. The combat itself is fine. It's very fast paced, but it's actually quite stop and start, as it nearly stops all your forward momentum once you do go into an attack, but once you get used to it, it's actually pretty decent. Didn't really like the guns and ranged attacks, so I'll say that now. It works on an auto target system and it's hit and miss literally, or simply like targets the wrong enemy. It's frustrating when you've got an enemy just slightly angled, down below you or above you, and Foregone has no interest in aiming at them, forcing you to put yourself now in harm's way or jump like immediately horizontal with them. Fortunately though, here I will say the enemy AI, about as dumb as it gets. It's set to very basic patrol patterns for the most part, basically going left and right. Also, unless you knock them off or they fall off, they are typically restricted to the platform they stand on. This leads to a handy little exploit where you just stand off the edge of the platform and jump up and down while slashing at their feet. Nothing they can do about it. While the game does then introduce things like stronger enemies, what I will say its main focus is to give you the impression it's getting harder is to increase the count as you progress. It's trying to give that feeling a challenge, but really it's just doing the old let's overwhelm them with a ton of enemies to battle off against, but you will see through that immediately. It is very easy just to run past all of these enemies. I did it plenty of times when I just ran straight through the level, fighting only those that had like a key above their head that had to be beat to progress. Well, you can do this, though I will say it wouldn't be too smart. That's because this game also fancies itself as a bit of a loot collecting experience. You're going to be picking up two things, gold and then blue gems. This currency then, it's used between levels at that hub board I mentioned earlier. Here you can upgrade your weapons, you can actually play with perks to level up your super soldier, or you can even sell some of the goods you have. When it comes to the perks, think things like extra damage, more health, a chance of a critical hit with each swing of your weapon. Can't say I really noticed a huge difference with these buffers outside of the obvious one like a bigger health bar, but it's still kind of a nice system that puts a little weight behind the idea that you should take down your foes because they will drop these goodies. The final system on controls then are specials. These are attached to the left and right trigger with varying abilities. My two favourites personally, there was a health regen and then a laser beam that screwed over everyone that was in front of me. Outside of this, there's really not much else aside from the occasional boss fight. This is the classic, set pattern. You'll need to understand what their moveset is to then exploit it. Classic of the genre, and I absolutely love it. Always have, sure I always will. Alright, so the big problem, the frame rate here is an absolute disaster. Starting with an intention to target 60 FPS, rarely manages this from the opening. It's typically floating around the 50 FPS mark. It felt choppy. On reflection though, it was amazing because the further I got, the more it dropped, to points where each level was actually now starting at 30 frames per second, but for the most part was hovering around 20, even going as low as 14 at points. This means the frame rate's getting lower as the difficulty is getting higher. For example, the game at this point introduced blind jumps that needed pinpoint accuracy. Here I was ready to press uninstall because the input lag and the whole jittery image was nearly enough to push me over the edge. Towards the end of the game, I will say I restarted it and it somewhat improved the situation. It seems this frame rate issue is actually accumulative, but even then, jumping back into these ladder levels after restarting, it was still kicking things off at 30 and it was pretty quickly making its way back to 20. The game, honestly, and I hate to say this, in its current state starts off with noticeable issues for sure, but by the end game, I would go as far as even saying barely playable. I don't think it's the greatest game ever, honestly. I'd describe it as okay, nothing really standing out, but this really damages it to the point where I nearly just quit before I even reached the end game and called it a day. I think for many of you as well, you're gonna have that experience at least on the Nintendo Switch. So graphically speaking, I loved the style, particularly the animation work behind our lead hero. Each weapon comes with its own unique attack pattern that really captures the weight and fluidity of these attacks. She very much looks like a badass. Enemies likewise are decent enough, but considerably more limited. Their movements, they typically only have one or two simple animations. The levels, they each come then with their own unique theme. Basically shows you moving across this world that's represented on a pretty nice overworld map. Boss fights in particular, really nice. The pixel style and 3D, it almost blends at points to create this think watercolor effect. This is where that Dead Cells comparison is somewhat coming from, and it in no way captures the level of detail that Dead Cells achieves, but it does at least walk away feeling like it has its own kind of personality. I just wish the AI matched the quality of the designs because they've done a really great job here and they could have been incredibly intimidating. Audio, and there's not too much to say honestly. There's the odd like bit of face work, most is more than fine. There's the occasional bit of cringe. The sound effects likewise decent, you know, weapons, effects, they capture the speed of the combat and the location. Music, it's actually pretty high quality stuff, you know, it's very orchestral in the background. Problem for me, it's also very generic, and I struggled to really hear something absolutely stand out that sounded unique. It's one of those, it's good until you turn off the console and you forget about it nearly immediately. So the final verdict on Foregone is a game I've been excited for that has just failed to live up to its influences or even idea, mainly in its execution. The levels not just linear but almost feel like they're simply padding out the runtime as you repeat that same process over and over again. The enemies, AI is just non-existent, they're just trapped to that single location, walking backwards and forwards. Walk out of sight, they're just going to continue walking backwards and forget that you just tried to stab them in the back with like a big old pointy sword. The combat, it holds too much back at the beginning to create a sense of progression, but it actually just results in it getting stale too quickly. I can see the idea they were going for, but it just lacks that something special for me. This though then is just topped off by that frame rate issue. It's something weird, like it's accumulating as you progress. And I want to clarify again, the game starts at 60, floating around 50, but by the kind of end game I was hitting as low as 14. Restart the game and sure, you'll somewhat save it for at least a short while, bumping it back up to that 30 mark. But before you know it, it's going to deteriorate on you again, and I can't recommend a game where restarting it will be absolutely necessary to even try and get through it. These frame rate issues, they become real apparent at about the halfway mark, and you're probably going to need to restart from there forwards. That's a lot of restarts, I will say that much. Creative weapons, sure, and it's definitely pretty, but that is not enough. Today I'm giving Foregone a bad 3 out of 10. It reached the point for me that it was barely playable, and there were so many moments where I died because the frame rate just absolutely crushed me. I had no idea what was going on. Now let's say they fix the frame rate, it's a locked 60 FPS, everybody is happy. Even then, I'd probably only be a slightly above average 6. It's just lacking a lot of the soul of its influences, and while that combat is super fast, it just, again, didn't really capture my attention, and I don't see any reason to go back, even if it played a lot smoother. With that then, like a shout out to the patrons of the channel who are just going above and beyond to support SwitchCorner. Helps more than you know, so thank you all so much. If you want to check that out for yourself though, I've linked it in the video description down below. Finally, like hit subscribe if you love the Switch as much as we all do here. Join our growing family, and I'll see you all on the next video. Thanks everyone.